Russia's president normally avoids this annual gathering of world leaders at the UN, but he came here on a whistle-stop trip, planning not even to spend a night in New York. The centrepiece of his speech, the idea of a grand coalition against ISIL.
We propose discussing whether it's possible to agree on a resolution aimed at coordinating the actions of all the forces that confront ISIL and other terrorist organisations. Once again, this coordination should be based on the principles of the UN Charter.
That reference to the UN Charter is important. Syria's seat at the UN is still occupied by Assad's ambassador. It would be a coalition including the Assad government and on its terms. The US would never accept that, but it and some of its Western allies are moderating their position on Assad's future, floating a compromise idea that perhaps he could stay on for a bit in a phased transition to a new government.
Yes, realism dictates that compromise will be required to end the fighting and ultimately stamp out ISIL. But realism also requires a managed transition away from Assad and to a new leader, and an inclusive government that recognizes there must be an end to this chaos so that the Syrian people can begin to rebuild.
That idea seemed to be immediately dismissed by France and by the first Gulf country to speak here, Qatar.
Is there a tyranny in the world that could acknowledge an alternative? Is it possible for a tyranny to allow an alternative to grow and develop under its shadow?
I can see diplomatic efforts being made to incorporate Bashar al-Assad in the process, but you can't work together. You can't put together victims and the people who are killing them. Assad is the origin of the problem. He cannot be part of the solution.
In Damascus, there may be some concern about the speech made by their staunchest ally. Iran said it wanted the recent nuclear talks to be a model for diplomacy on Syria, and President Rouhani then added this.
As we aided the establishment of democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan, we are prepared to help bring about democracy in Syria as well as Yemen.
The real business here takes place away from the speeches in the General Assembly chamber. This is the formal lunch with the Secretary General of the United Nations sitting between the Russian and the US leader. President Putin and President Obama later held a further meeting to discuss the situation in Syria and in Ukraine. After 4.5 years of war in Syria, it's hard to be optimistic, but this is the first serious diplomatic push for 18 months since the collapse of peace talks in Geneva. Everyone knows a fresh effort to end the conflict will face immense hurdles. James Bays, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations.